In the future, time travel technology has been invented, but the moment it went public, governments immediately banned it. Only certain crime syndicates were using it in secret. To silently eliminate their enemies, they'd send targets back in time through a time machine, where a looper would be waiting to execute them. The syndicates would strap silver bars to each target as payment for the looper. By the rules, loopers were forbidden from removing a target's hood or trying to learn anything about them. But if one day the target showed up with gold bars instead of silver, that meant the person was the looper's future self. 30 years down the line, killing your own future self was called closing the loop. At that point, the looper could take the gold and retire, enjoying whatever years they had left. Until 30 years later, when the syndicate would capture them and send them back to be killed by their younger self, completing the cycle. That's exactly why they were called loopers. Joe was young, but he was no rookie. He'd been in the game since childhood and had stacked up serious wealth, locked away in a safe at home. Lately, there had been a wave of unease among the loopers, for had closed their loops in a single month, way faster than normal. Then one night, his buddy Seth came crashing through the door. Seth was a looper too. He was in a full panic, telling Joe the syndicate was hunting him down. Earlier that day, when his target arrived, the man was humming a lullaby, the exact song Seth's mother used to sing to him as a child. He knew instantly it was his future self. Driven by curiosity, he yanked off the hood. Old Seth told him that in the future, a man known as the Rainmaker had risen to power overnight, taking control of every major crime syndicate, and had ordered all loopers to have their loops closed immediately. Then old Seth broke free and ran. Young Seth just stood there and let him go without pulling the trigger. Joe immediately grasped how serious this was. A looper who fails to close his loop becomes a target for the entire organization. Just then, syndicate hitmen had already tracked down Joe's place. He stashed Seth inside his personal safe and played dumb. The hitmen searched the place, found nothing, and dragged Joe back to headquarters to see the boss. The boss had come back from the future himself, tasked with managing all the loopers. He kept a crew of gunmen to hunt down anyone who broke the rules. The boss could tell right away Joe was lying. He gave Joe a choice: give up Seth's location, or kiss his golden retirement goodbye. Faced with choosing between money and his best friend, Joe chose the money. He gave up Seth. Meanwhile, future Seth was on the run with his gold when he noticed his fingers beginning to vanish, one by one. Then his nose disappeared. He tried to rush back to find his younger self, but before he could take more than a few steps, his legs were gone too. Then his hands. Then all of him. Because in that moment, young Seth was being mutilated, tortured into a human stump, before finally being shot dead. When the past dies, the future ceases to exist. Betraying his friend left Joe with a gnawing guilt. But the very next day, during his own assignment, something went wrong. His target didn't show up on schedule. Just as Joe figured the job had been called off, the target appeared. No hood, no restraints. The two locked eyes. Joe knew immediately. This was his future self. We'll call him Old Joe. Joe didn't hesitate. He raised his gun. But Old Joe spun around and used the gold bars strapped to his back to block the shot. While Joe was reloading, Old Joe hurled a gold bar and knocked him out cold. By the time Joe came to, Old Joe was long gone. He'd left behind a note telling Joe to get out of the city. Since Joe had failed to close the loop, the syndicate would be coming for him. If Joe died, Old Joe would cease to exist too. Joe ignored the warning. He snuck back home to grab his silver bars and make a run for it. But the place had already been ransacked, and hitmen were waiting inside. Joe had no choice but to bolt through the window, but lost his grip on the way down and fell. Old Joe showed up just in time, gunning down the pursuers and pulling the unconscious Joe to safety. He took them to a local library, where he used a set of numbers he'd memorized to pull up records, tracking down the home addresses of 3 children. Back on Joe's end, he woke up and decided, no more running. He was going to find Old Joe and close the loop. Then, out of nowhere, words began appearing on Old Joe's hand, carved into the skin, an address for a diner he used to frequent back in the day. He understood immediately. Young Joe was calling him out. Old Joe showed up the next day, right on time. Joe confronted him, furious. You already lived your 30 years. Why won't you just take the bullet so I can have the life I fought for? So Old Joe laid it all out. In his timeline, he'd successfully closed his loop, walked away with a fortune in gold, and moved to Shanghai. But he burned through every last coin in just 10 years living large. With nothing left, he went back to contract killing. Then, in his 23rd year, he met the woman who changed everything, a woman named Susie. They fell hard for each other, eventually relocating to a quiet village in the countryside, living off the grid. But in the 30th year, syndicate enforcers came to take him back. They burned down their home and shot his wife dead in cold blood. Unable to accept her death, Old Joe launched an attack in the moment before he was sent back. He took out the hitmen, then commandeered the machine and transported himself back on his own terms. He told Joe that in the future, the Rainmaker appeared out of nowhere, rising to power through sheer terror, seizing control of the world's 5 biggest crime syndicates. Nobody knew who he really was. Legend had it that the Rainmaker, as a child, had watched his mother get murdered by a looper. So once he came to power, he ordered every looper to be closed. No exceptions. Old Joe had come back to kill the Rainmaker before he ever became one, to rewrite the future and save his wife. He'd tracked down 3 children from the records. One of them was the Rainmaker as a kid. Old Joe's plan: kill all 3, no chances taken. But Joe, who hadn't lived any of Old Joe's life, couldn't care less. All he wanted was to take out Old Joe and close his loop. He was about to make his move when Old Joe stopped him cold. He knew his younger self inside out. Right then, syndicate hitmen closed in on them. The two split and ran. In the chaos, Joe managed to tear off a piece of Old Joe's map. It had the address of one of the children on it. Joe followed the address to a remote farm where a single mother and her son were living. He knew Old Joe would come to kill the boy, so he decided to wait him out. That night, he saw the boy's mother step outside with a shotgun and charged out. Thinking Old Joe had shown up, he put himself between her and whatever was out there, only to find it was just a homeless drifter. After running him off, the adrenaline crash hit hard, add in withdrawals from his addiction, and Joe just collapsed. The boy's mother took him in. The next morning, Joe came around and learned that the boy's mother was named Sarah. Sarah asked Joe what he was doing on her farm. Joe just pulled out the map and said he might need to stick around for a while. But when Sarah saw the string of numbers on the map, she leveled a salt-loaded shotgun at his chest and pulled the trigger. Those numbers were her son's birthday and his birth hospital code. She demanded to know how he had her son's information. Joe had no choice but to come clean. He told Sarah everything about the loopers and the legend of the Rainmaker. Sarah didn't fully understand all of it, but she understood enough. Her son was in danger. She agreed to team up with Joe to deal with old Joe, but made one thing clear. Stay away from her kid. Meanwhile, old Joe had already tracked down one of the children. Torn up inside, he pulled the trigger anyway. Back at the farm, days passed without any sign of old Joe. Joe slowly got to know Sarah and her son Sid. Sid was sharp as a tack, and once he found out Joe was there to protect him, he suggested to his mom that they take turns keeping watch with Joe. Sarah shut that down immediately. She told Sid to stay away from Joe, but being told no sent Sid spiraling. His emotions went completely off the rails. Watching her son lose control, Sarah bolted from the room and locked herself inside a steel vault, waiting until Sid had calmed down before she dared come back out. Sarah kept telling Sid to steer clear of Joe, but Joe had been quietly watching over them for days, and that slowly got to her. That night, she let her guard down completely. The next morning, Joe woke up to find Sarah gone. He went downstairs to look for her, and found her being held at gunpoint by syndicate hitmen. They ordered Joe to surrender. Then Sid appeared at the top of the stairs. One of the hitmen swung his gun toward the boy on instinct. The sight of it sent Sid tumbling backward down the stairs. In that same moment, Sarah grabbed Joe and threw them both out the door. And then, something shifted in Sid's eyes as he hit the floor. Something cold, something dangerous. With a scream, Sid unleashed something unreal. The hitman and every piece of furniture in the room shot into the air. Then a deafening blast, and the hitman exploded. Joe understood it in an instant. A kid with power like that. Sid was the Rainmaker. No wonder he could single-handedly take over 5 major crime syndicates. Witnessing what Sid could do flipped a switch in Joe. A child carrying that kind of destructive power was a walking time bomb. Sarah pleaded with him. She was convinced she could teach Sid to control his emotions and his abilities. Joe didn't listen. He took his gun and went looking for Sid, who had already fled the scene. But the moment Joe saw the pain and confusion in the kid's eyes, he couldn't go through with it. He was just a child. Being powerful wasn't his fault. Meanwhile, old Joe had taken out the second child, but walked straight into a syndicate ambush. The hitmen dragged him back to headquarters to face the boss. Then old Joe broke free, snatched a gun, and went on an absolute rampage. Nobody saw it coming. The whole organization had no time to react. Old Joe tore through the entire syndicate. The boss from the future, included. Only one low-ranking lieutenant survived, shot in the leg, and he found the markings on old Joe's map. Old Joe pushed on and drove out to Sarah's farm. Joe cut him off on the road. Old Joe told him everything. The syndicate was gone, wiped out. No one was left to hunt Joe down. The car was loaded with gold he'd taken from their vaults. Joe could drive away right now and live whatever life he wanted. But by then, Joe had something that mattered more than gold. Sarah and Sid. While the two faced off, the wounded lieutenant came roaring in on a hoverbike, guns blazing. Joe dodged and spun around, dropping him with a single shot. But when he turned back, old Joe had already gone. Old Joe had beaten him to the farm, blocking the road as Sarah and Sid tried to flee. He opened fire on the car without hesitation. The blast sent Sid's powers surging out of control. The car flipped. They scrambled out and ran into the sugarcane fields. Old Joe's shot caught Sid in the jaw. That was all it took. A massive shockwave erupted from Sid and tore across the field. Both Sarah and old Joe were thrown into the air. Sarah rushed to Sid and held him close, talking him down, and slowly, Sid's rage settled. They both drifted back to the ground. Old Joe reached for his gun again, ready to finish it. Sarah stepped in front of her son. Then Joe arrived, and in that moment, everything clicked. Old Joe killing Sarah right in front of Sid. That was the moment that broke him. That was how the Rainmaker was born. Raised in grief and hatred, becoming the monster the world feared, which would lead to the syndicate killing old Joe's wife. And the whole brutal cycle would keep spinning, trapping everyone inside it. Joe saw it all clearly now. There was only one way to break the loop. He turned the gun on himself and pulled the trigger. Old Joe vanished the instant. Joe gave his life so Sarah and Sid could have theirs. With Sarah by his side, maybe Sid had a real shot at becoming someone worth believing in.